I'm Andy Patton, and this is Rhyme and Reason from the Rabbit Room. Each season we look at the life and work of one poet, starting with Gerard Manley Hopkins. In this season, we've talked a lot about the beauty of Hopkins' work. Many of his poems aim to capture God's beauty in the particulars of creation and render it in language. But Hopkins is also known for poems that plumb the depths of the human experience as well as its heights. There's a darker streak that runs through many of his poems. It wasn't all flowers and rainbows, especially in the poems written toward the end of his short life, when his own suffering and misery reached a crescendo. These darker poems, among them the group that's sometimes called the Terrible Sonnets, are not cynical or nihilistic, but rather they're weighted with a sad and poignant wisdom that not everyone can capture. And we wouldn't wish the kind of suffering that Hopkins experienced on anyone. But anytime a great artist experiences pain and then makes great art out of that pain, it begs the question, if he hadn't suffered, how would his work have been different? Could he have written a poem like the one we're about to read? Now here is The Caged Skylark by Gerard Manley Hopkins. As a dare-gale skylark scanted in a dull cage, man's mounting spirit in his bone house, mean house dwells. That bird, beyond the remembering of his free fells, this in drudgery, day laboring out life's age. Though aloft on turf or perch or poor low stage, both sing sometimes the sweetest spells. Yet both droop deadly sometimes in their cells, or ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. Not that the sweet fowl, song-fowl needs no rest. Why, hear him babble and drop down to his nest. But his own nest, wild nest, no prison. Man's spirit will be flesh-bound when found at best, but uncumbered. Meadow down is not distressed for a rainbow footing it, nor he for his bones risen. Hopkins did not lead what anyone would call an easy life. In his biography of Hopkins, Paul Mariani writes that he suffered from a handful of chronic maladies, including head colds, headaches, bleeding hemorrhoids, depression, and diarrhea, possibly due to an undiagnosed case of what today we might call Crohn's disease. One of his Jesuit colleagues told of a time he walked in on Hopkins grading papers at 3 a.m. and sobbing uncontrollably with his head wrapped in wet towels because he was in so much pain. Margaret Ellsberg notes that Hopkins is remembered for being delicate and high-strung and frail. He hated teaching and loathed giving sermons. He seemed to have no gift for pastoral work. Yet his last handful of years were spent at a teaching post in Dublin. And it was in Dublin that his life went from challenging but marked by both suffering and joy to bleak, to the point of madness. During this time, he was responsible for setting and grading 6 examinations a year for his students, each with hundreds of candidates. And that task was made even more difficult by his own unrelenting perfectionism. He took painstaking care and labored over the fine details of the grades to the point of exhaustion. He described himself as drowning in all the grading, yet despite his hard work, he was apparently an unpopular teacher whose students rarely came to his classes. And yet, it was in the midst of this difficult time that he wrote some of his most abiding poetry, the so-called terrible sonnets. Ellsberg writes of his last years that, quote, the much discussed conflict between Hopkins' natural character as a connoisseur of beauty and his career as a slum-dwelling, scrupulously obedient servant of his insensitive superiors came home to roost in the last 5 years in Dublin. He was often, and then fatally sick, responding to God not in nature, but in his own personal desolation. The sonnets of these Dublin years provide impeccably managed and edited examples of mature poetic genius. Let's talk about our poem, A Caged Skylark. As the title indicates, the poem focuses on a bird in a cage. Yet, like so many of Hopkins' poems, there's a larger significance to be found in the concrete details and images. A Caged Skylark isn't about a caged skylark. It's about the cage of the frailties and foibles of the human body, and about the resurrection, and about the new creation. Let's unpack that idea a little bit and walk through the lines of the poem to see how the images are giving rise to the larger questions the poem is asking, and the even larger answers it's supplying. The poem begins with a skylark in a cage. Yet a comparison is being made. The bird is like, quote, man's mounting spirit in his bone house. So the body is the cage in the comparison that keeps the spirit from mounting to the sky like a bird. And Hopkins carries the comparison further. The bird has been so long in the cage that it no longer remembers its days of free flying. Likewise, this body day labors out its days in drudgery. Then Hopkins writes, though aloft on turf or perch or poor low stage, both sing sometimes the sweetest, sweetest spells. So Hopkins is working with these dual images. Even birds in cages give us beautiful birdsong. And even humanity, laboring in drudgery, can wring beauty in wonder and beauty in work, despite the mean bone house of the body that shackles them in. Which is a pretty desperate and damning assessment of human work and the suffering the body sometimes brings us. We can make beauty. We can sing the sweetest spells. But even so, to quote the poem again, like a caged bird, we still sometimes fling our bodies against their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. At the turn of the poem, Hopkins brings in another comparison, a free bird. This is where you get the lines, not that the sweet fowl, song fowl, needs no rest. Why, hear him babble and drop down to his nest, but his own nest, wild nest, no prison. So the free bird and the caged bird are compared, and they both make beautiful songs. And at the end of it, the free bird drops down to his own nest, a wild nest, which is no prison. He isn't the caged skylark. And then the final comparison of the poem comes in. The free bird is compared to humanity resurrected. But the thing that humanity is freed from in the resurrection is not the body, but the encumbrances of sin. Hopkins writes in the poem, man's spirit will be flesh-bound when found at best, but uncumbered when his bones are risen. So how do we interpret this? What sense do we make of it? There's a sense in which a poem is a work of art in itself. Viewed this way, it is self-contained, and we don't need to speculate about parallels between the life of the author of the poem and the meanings contained in the poem. And that is a valid level at which to engage with a poem or any work of art. But if we stop at that level, there are often layers of meaning in the work that still remain untapped and unseen. As we've said before, a growing understanding of Hopkins' life sheds light on his work. And it works the other way, too. A growing understanding of his poetry can shed light on themes in his life. And I think that dynamic is in play with this poem, too. Hopkins is talking about birds, but he is also talking about life, his life. By the end of the poem, you can almost hear his longing for the resurrection, rising out of long years of personal suffering and hardship and failure. In the poem, he draws our attention to the free bird and contrasts it with the caged bird and says, yes, the free bird still needs rest, but it is free. It is at peace, and you can almost hear him asking, when will I be free? When will I be at peace? And the answer he gives is in the new creation, on the far side of the resurrection, when he will still be flesh-bound, but will be free to sing the sweetest spells without ringing himself against the bars of his cage in bursts of fear or rage. Now, with all that in mind, here is the Caged Skylark again. As a dare-gale skylark scanted in a dull cage, man's mounting spirit in his bone house, mean house dwells. That bird, beyond the remembering of his free fells, this in drudgery, day laboring out life's age. Though aloft on turf or perch or poor low stage, both sing sometimes the sweetest, sweetest spells. Yet both droop deadly sometimes in their cells, or ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. Not that the sweet fowl, song-fowl needs no rest. Why, hear him babble and drop down to his nest. But his own nest, wild nest, no prison. Man's spirit will be flesh-bound when found at best, but uncumbered. Meadow down is not distressed for a rainbow footing it, nor he for his bones risen.
The music from this episode was from Then There Was You by Beneath the Mountain, Clear View by Okaya.
Continuance.
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 Continuance. By Yehezkel Raz. That's a hard one.
By Yehezkel Raz.
Okay.
Protocols by Ardie Son. One word reworked.
By Christopher Galovan.
By Christopher Galovan.
Galovan.
The sound design and editing is by Nate Sheppard. You can get more poetry from the Rabbit Room
By subscribing to our newsletter.
Dada,
Yeah.
can we listen to them?
Sure.
Yay!